Manfred Albrecht Freer von Richthofen was born into an aristocratic Prussian family in Breslau in what is now Poland in 1892. His education was in a succession of military schools and academies. He was an excellent athlete, he was a fine horseman, and he was initially commissioned into the 1st Regiment of the Uhlans Kaiser Alexander III in 1911. And after the war started in 1914, he served on both the Western and Eastern fronts as a cavalry officer. By 1915, he was transferred into the Imperial German Army Air Service, and there he studied aerial tactics under the master German strategist, a man named Hauptmann Oswald Boelcke. And he flew his first combat mission after less than 30 hours of flight instruction. Now, in spite of a rather rocky start as a fighter pilot, he was invited to join Boelcke's Jagdstaffel II squadron, and he soon excelled in combat by following the Boelcke dicta, which included approaching your enemy from above with the sun behind you, firing only when you get to close range, always keeping your eyes on the target, and attack with a group of 4 to 6 planes. By the beginning of 1917, the Red Baron, as he came to be known, had 16 confirmed aerial victories, and he had already been awarded Germany's highest military decoration, the Pour le Mérite, and was a commander of his own squadron, the Jasta 11. In April 1917 alone, bloody April, he downed 22 British planes. He began to have his Albatross aircrafts painted red. As his title, Freer, was translated into English as Baron, it didn't take very long before he was known to the world as the Red Baron. His squadron was combined with 3 others to form what was known as Jagdgeschwader I, which was widely feared and known as the Flying Circus because of their colorful paint schemes. His younger brother Lothar was also a fighter pilot, but was far more daring than Manfred, confirming 40 victories and, ironically, unlike his brother, surviving the war. In July of 1917, Richthofen crashed in Belgium after being attacked by Captain Donald Cunnell of the Royal Flying Corps, and he suffered a severe head injury, very likely a skull fracture in that crash. Now, in spite of blurred consciousness and visual compromise, he managed to land his plane. Over the next several months, he still flew occasionally and had several operations to remove bone splinters from his head wound. He suffered from severe headaches, and there was a very noticeable change in his personality, which persisted from that time until his death. Against medical advice, he returned to regular flying with his group by October of 1917, downing 18 more planes over the next 6 months. This brought his total to 80 aerial victories. He was the leading air ace of World War I, followed by René Fonck of France, who had 75 confirmed victories, and Billy Bishop of Canada, who had 72. Both Fonck and Bishop not only survived the war, but lived into the 1950s. But that wasn't to be the story for Manfred von Richthofen. Von Richthofen met his end on the 21st of April, 1918, under rather unusual circumstances. He was pursuing a Canadian pilot named Lieutenant Wilfred May, who didn't have a lot of experience, but he was also being pursued by a much more seasoned pilot by the name of Captain Arthur Roy Brown. Brown dived steeply at the Baron, fired at him before having to climb to avoid crashing into the ground. The Baron resumed his pursuit of May, but soon came under concentrated fire from Australian troops on the ground. Now, this was something the Baron didn't normally do. He knew better than to fly that close to the ground to risk being fired on from the ground. He ended up making a rough landing in this field behind me near the Somme River. The soldiers who had fired on his plane from the ground were the first to arrive at his red Fokker triplane, and they claimed to have heard him mumble some things, including the word kaput, but we really don't know for sure. The exact accounts of damage to his plane before being dismantled by soldiers who were seeking souvenirs are pretty difficult to come by, so we really just don't know a lot about those circumstances. Just, I don't know, maybe a half a mile or so, maybe a quarter mile even, in that direction, you see a chimney there, and it's real prominent when you're driving into this area, and the top of the chimney is missing. And I've read a number of people who have claimed that the top of that chimney was taken off by none other than Manfred von Richthofen himself. When he was coming in for a crash landing, he knocked off the top of that chimney before landing in this field. I think it's baloney, and I don't think there's any evidence of it. I don't even know if the chimney was there at that time, but it's just one of those stories that people like to share. His body was taken to an Australian Flying Corps hangar at Poulainville. He was washed by a corpsman and then briefly examined by 4 medical officers. The body was not opened for an autopsy. However, they did probe the entrance and exit wounds with a fence wire to try to determine a trajectory of those wounds. Subsequent reports by 2 of the men who examined him, one who was a colonel and the other was a captain, actually conflicted with one another. So we really don't 100% know for sure what happened. But the most plausible conclusion, after several viewings of his body as well as from eyewitnesses on the ground, suggests that there was a single bullet that entered from Richthofen's right lateral chest, passed through his right lung, through his heart, and exited through his left chest. Before the red Fokker airplane was scavenged and torn to pieces till there was very little left of it, some thought that they saw a single bullet hole on the right side of the cockpit, which lined up with his chest entry and exit wounds. He was buried on April 22nd in a village churchyard near here in Amiens, France, after a military funeral that was conducted by Commonwealth forces. There's actually a film that exists showing parts of that funeral as it happened. Now, Captain Roy Brown received a bar to his Distinguished Flying Cross, but not the Victoria Cross, which had earlier been allegedly promised by Britain for the man who killed the Red Baron. Now, in spite of a number of claimants, no Australian soldier received any sort of decoration or recognition for having caused von Richthofen's end. The most likely scenario for the death of the Red Baron, which seems to be supported not only by the eyewitness testimony on the ground, but also by the evidence on his body and on the plane, should probably give credit to a man named Sergeant Cedric Popkin of the 24th Machine Gun Company of the 1st Australian Imperial Force, who was firing his Vickers machine gun at the red Fokker DR-1 triplane as it banked and fled to avoid fire from Lewis machine guns that were being manned by men named Robert Buey and Snowy Evans. but we really will never 100% know for sure. When Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, was initially killed in April of 1918, he was buried in a local church cemetery near the spot where he died along the Somme River. But in 1920, as the work was undergone to relocate all the German graves into German war cemeteries, the Baron was brought here to the Fricourt cemetery outside of the town of Albert. And he was buried in number 4, grave 1177, which today bears the name of Sebastian Postian. And that's because in 1925, after just 5 years of being here, the Baron's brother actually had him exhumed and brought home to Germany, where he lies today. It's often been said that there was no glamour in trench warfare, but for many, aerial warfare was the stuff of gallant knights of the air dueling in single combat above the mud and misery and death of the trenches below them. The fact that Baron von Richthofen was almost certainly brought to death barely above the trenches by an Australian machine gunner remains one of the great ironies of the war to end all wars.